Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the prosecutor's fallacy, and we will end by returning to Sally Clark, the person who you guys did your pre-assignment based on. So we'll get there. It's called Sally Clark's Innocence, but the story's not fantastic. Okay, so let's start off. Before we jump into explaining what happened in the Sally Clark case, let's just look what the prosecutor's fallacy is. The prosecutor's fallacy states that the probability of some event A occurring, given that we already know B, is equal to the probability of B occurring, given that we already know A. That's not true. Remember, this is the prosecutor's fallacy, which means it's false. So the assumption, and when you hear it, you're going to hear it. It actually sounds pretty natural in most contexts. When you hear it, you're going to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I'm totally down with that. But if I give you a very simple example, you can see it's wrong. And then we have to note that if it's wrong in the simple example, even in those more complicated examples where it sounds good, it's still wrong. So essentially, this is just a misunderstanding or misapplication of conditional probability again. The probability of A, given the condition that B already exists. So at this point, you might be thinking, wait a second, Shay, this is topics. We didn't sign up for this class. That seems like some really fancy probability notation and some big words. Don't worry too much about it. We're going to make sense of this here. I'm going to keep the symbols for a little bit, only because this kind of silly thing, I think, will help us understand that the prosecutor's fallacy is, in fact, a fallacy. So what I have written here, let's look at the left side first. We have a female human and a pregnant human. So the first thing is saying, what is the probability that a human is a female if we already know, given the condition that that person is pregnant? So note, this is almost certainly true. If I have a condition given to me that a human is pregnant, I can find the probability that that human is a female, which is essentially 100%. Now, the prosecutor's fallacy would state that these two things were equal. I have here the truth. They're not equal. Let's look at it the other way around. The right-hand side of this equation would state, what is the probability that a person is pregnant if we know that person is a woman? So given that a person's a woman, what's the probability that they're pregnant? Clearly, these things are not equal. The first was almost guaranteed. The second, well, most women we know are not pregnant at any given moment. So we have this here is actually a really high probability. The right side is a very, very low probability. So my goal here is that we should have, in a very simple example, shown the prosecutor's fallacy is false. I can't just switch the event and the condition and have them have the exact same values. I hope you guys understand that. You might be thinking right now, this seems so obvious. Well, good. It was supposed to seem obvious. That's why I picked that example. The idea is if we understand from that obvious example that the logic is flawed, we can look for that flawed logic when we get to much more subtle situations. And again, they do become more subtle, especially in like the Sally Clark trial. So before we get to Sally Clark, let's take a look at this in a legal setting. So here we have a woman with a purse walking down the street in London. And unfortunately, that woman walking down the street was robbed. And also, more unfortunately, she had a lot of cash in her bag. So when she realizes what happens, she calls for the police come over, and they're like, ma'am, what happened? She's like, my purse has been stolen. What can you tell us about the person who stole it? I don't know who it was, but they were about 5'8"ish. They had red hair, and they were wearing glasses. So the police file a report. Later in the day, a police officer spots a man, really cheeky man there, who meets this description. And that man happens to be carrying a brand new TV that he bought with cash. Uh-oh, doesn't look good. Clink, clink, he's got the cuffs out. So we end up at this person's trial. At this person's trial, the prosecutor points out that there is only a 1 in 500,000 chance, 1.5 million chance, that a random person would meet the description given by the victim. And we happen to have found this man who meets the description. So he suggests that this means there's only a 1 in 500,000 chance that this man could be innocent. And again, I know you're hearing this in the context of a math class where I'm trying to make it look silly and absurd, but this happens in trials all of the time. Only 1 in 500,000 chance that a random person would meet this description. And we found this man carrying a TV that he bought in cash that meets this description. It doesn't look good for him. But this is exactly the prosecutor's fallacy. What he did here is he's suggesting that because the probability of an innocent man matching the description of a guilty man is low, this would mean that the probability that this man is innocent is also low. But that's not the case. It's the exact same false logic that was used in the pregnancy example. He's assuming that those two conditional probabilities are related when in fact they are not. So to kind of further prove this prosecutor's fallacy, because you might have still heard that and been like, yeah, but 1 in 500,000 and he was caught with a TV he bought at cash that day, it doesn't look good. I want to prove again that that is not enough evidence. So let's continue with this London example. It turns out the population of London is 8.982 million people. Now, if you recall, the odds given were 1 out of every 500,000 people would meet that description. So if I just divide the population of London, 8.982 million, by the 500,000, it turns out there's 17.964, or let's call it 18 people, that would meet that description. So there's 18 people who would meet in London, just in the immediate London area, who would meet the description of the victim, of the perpetrator given by the victim. Well, there we have 18 of them. Gorgeous, aren't they? Of these 18 individuals, though, for the sake of my argument, they're all different individuals. So of these 18 people who meet the description, only 1 would be guilty. The other 17 of these people would be innocent. Thus, the actual probability as a person who matched the description given by the victim was innocent was not the unlikely 1 in 500,000, 1.5 million that the prosecutor suggested. And it would seem like what the prosecutor was saying was true. But in reality, even accepting the numbers the prosecutor used, the truth is that there's really only a 1 in 18 chance that person would be guilty and a 17 in 18 chance they'd be innocent. That is a severely drastic difference in statistics. And if the prosecutor had said, hey, there's only a 1 in 18% chance we've got the 1 in 18 chance we've got the right guy, I want you to convict him, no jury would do that. But if he makes it like there's only a 1 in 500,000 chance we have the wrong guy, well, the jury might be willing to convict. Again, the prosecutor's fallacy means that it was false to suggest that this was the probability of him being innocent. The true probability of him being innocent was 17 in 18. Okay, this brings us back to Sally Clark. And guys, this story is tragic. So I'm going to jump to the part of the story where the expert, the quote-unquote expert, this is something that I think we also have to be... we just have to accept about ourselves as humans. We're not stat experts. Most of us aren't statistic experts. So if we have an expert telling us something, we put a lot of trust in the expert being just that, an expert, and knowing what they're really talking about. And so what was happening in the trial was there was some evidence from the coroner that the children might have had some trauma, and then that was looked at by like 5 other doctors, and they were like, no way, not a chance. It was just SIDS. It had nothing to do with that. So at this point, the prosecution's case was not looking very good. Whatever they thought they had for evidence, the defense did a very good job defending. And so they called in, he was actually a child abuse expert. He was not a statistical expert. He was an expert in the area of child abuse. And so he came in and he reported these stats that, I'll tell you, A, the stats are wrong, and not only were the stats wrong, but he presented them in a way that led to the prosecutor's fallacy. Okay, so what he testified was that the chance of 2 children from an affluent family suffering sudden infant death syndrome, hereon known as SIDS, was 1 in 73 million. So the prosecutor restated this, saying the probability of her 2 infants dying naturally was 1 in 73 million. Of course, the implication of this is that if the probability of them dying naturally was 1 in 73 million, then we're talking about a 72,999,999 to 73 million chance that they died of unnatural causes. So the premise is because the chances of them dying, both dying from naturally causes, was so low that we think it inherently should suggest that means the probability of them dying of unnatural causes is extremely high. Well, that's not true. It's, in fact, again, the prosecutor's fallacy. Two children dying from SIDS is totally unlikely. That 1 in 73 million is not the correct number. I think I'm going to revisit that in a second. But it's still extremely unlikely. The problem is, it being unlikely is not enough evidence to give us information about how likely it is that Sally murdered her children. In fact, if it's a 1 in 73 million chance that they died naturally, let's consider the explanation that was given by the prosecutors. They said instead she murdered her children. Well, guess what? If it's 1 in 73 million, if it's super unlikely that two kids die of SIDS, it is much, much more unlikely that two children die of their mother killing them. As a matter of fact, the numbers have estimated to be 10 to 100 times less frequent than just the odds of two kids dying of SIDS death. So that means the probability she murdered her children is it's somewhere between 1 in 730 million to 1 in 7.3 billion. So that tells us it's much less likely than the false statistics given by the prosecutor that was 1 in 73 million, that she was innocent. So they suggested there was a 1 in 73 million chance she was innocent, but they would never actually went out to say that there's a 1 in 7.3 billion chance she's guilty. It's much less likely she is guilty when you look at the statistics this way. Unfortunately, her defense failed to point out this probability, the fact that it's more unlikely that she killed them, and the fact that the first one wasn't actually an honest stat to begin with. It was the prosecutor's fallacy. So this was just one of many errors in this sad story. And that was our focus. Our focus was on the prosecutor's fallacy. Assuming because the odds of them both dying innocently was low, that somehow implied the odds of them dying not innocently was extremely high. That was false. A couple other errors that I'll just tell you to give you a better understanding of this story. There was another error that was known as the independence assumption. So Meadow, the expert, when he calculated his numbers, he assumed that the probability of having one baby die due to SIDS doesn't affect the other, which would allow him to multiply the probabilities of each happening to get an even less likely scenario. Well, there's a problem with this. For genetic reasons, if one child dies of SIDS because it could be something passed on in the genes, it can actually increase the chances of having the second. So I told you that 1 in 73 million number wasn't correct to begin with. This is one of the reasons it wasn't correct to begin with. There was a second fallacy. Again, fallacy meaning falsehood. So this is known as the ecological fallacy. It's a formal fallacy in the interpretation of statistical data that occurs when inferences about the nature of an individual, the nature of Sally, was deduced from inferences about the group to which those individuals belong. So what Meadow did when he was making his statistic was and I don't think he did this with malintent. I should kind of say that. I think Meadow was very passionate about protecting children and thought he had a situation where somebody needed to be held accountable. But in doing so, he committed these fallacies. And in this one, he pigeonholed the Clarks into a lower risk category based on some cherry-picked details. White, upper class, suburban, that kind of category is going to make it less likely to have a kid die of SIDS. And because he chose to look at them in just that category as opposed to the whole population, he was able to get a lower chance of this happening naturally. So again, that 1 in 73 million number was not correct to begin with, even before the prosecutor's fallacy was applied to it. So does all of this matter? Yeah, it does, guys. I'm using a false example of a robbery, and now using Sally Clark's very, very real story to try to explain this to you. But it's called the prosecutor's fallacy for a reason. This happens all of the time in courts. And people are not trained or numerically literate enough to recognize when it happens. So to underscore how much this matters, a juror on that Sally Clark trial had reported to a friend that the jury deliberated for 2 days, and during that deliberation, the medical evidence was pretty much cast aside. The medical evidence was contradicted, so it didn't stand up, and so what they ended up arguing over, and what convinced them, was Meadows' argument that, there's, again, the implication that there was only a 1 in 73 million chance she was innocent. Those numbers were so astronomical that the jury felt they had to convict her. And they did. She was convicted of a crime she didn't commit. So how bad was this? Well, let's think about this. This poor woman lost a child, wanted children so bad that she gave it a second shot, had a child, lost that child. What you guys don't know about the story was, while she was grieving and before this trial started, before she was formally charged with anything, she actually had conceived a third child who she was raising at the time of this. Then the trial happened, and poor Sally's name was just dragged through the mud. The tabloids, the press painted her as a businesswoman climbing to the top, had no time for children. They never considered the fact that if she had no time for children, why did she have a second one after she allegedly killed the first? And why did she have a third after she allegedly killed the second? They didn't address these. They just painted her as this terrible woman who was self-interested and trying to move to the top. So we're not done yet. We know she's been convicted. This story doesn't have a happy ending. She does get released from jail, but for anybody who doesn't want to know the full thing, maybe fast forward the next 30 seconds. So she does get released from jail. People kept appealing it. On January 29th of 2003, she finally gets released, in a large part because plenty of other mathematicians, this was huge news at the time, and mathematicians weighed in. They were writing the courts, they were writing the jurors, the lawyers, trying to get this appealed. And they essentially got, in one of the appeals, the judge said, look, these statistics are clearly garbage. And he actually made some terrible accusation that, but the jury should have known that. And I disagree with that wholeheartedly. So anyway, she does get released, but she never recovers. She never recovers from spending years in prison away from her living child, from being blamed for the death of her 2 previous children, from all of the terrible things that were said about her. And she ends up 4 years later just being found dead in the house from alcohol poisoning. So very, very tragic story of someone who was convicted falsely by statistics. Not only, so it's such a tragedy of errors, because the statistics themselves were false. And then the interpretations of those statistics were also false. So yeah, that's our story of Sally Clark. It's not a great one. For your guys' assignment this week, you have another situation I actually took out of a courtroom. And you guys are going to read through the descriptions that were given. You are going to then pretend you're on that jury and you're in that back room deliberating. And everybody else on the jury hears those astronomical numbers and believes them, and you've got to convince them that statistical, that quote-unquote statistical evidence based on probabilities is somehow false, and you should probably try to show them what the true statistic is. So I hope you take this job seriously, because as I've just shown you, life's seriously hanging in the balance here. People's understanding of numbers, numerical literacy, let's call it. That's what we're talking about now. Lives truly depend on it. All right, guys, I hope you found this fascinating, and I look forward to reading your responses. Have a good one. Bye.